All right, let's dive right into this masterclass on Brazilian cultural policies. If you're gearing up for the FADE Concourses exam for UFPA, you are in exactly the right place. We're going to map out exactly how the Brazilian state and society have historically managed, funded, and organized our culture. We're talking about everything from organizing artistic production and protecting national heritage, all the way to meeting the symbolic needs of the population. And don't worry, we are sticking strictly to the foundational facts you need to ace that exam. To keep things super clear and help you build those mental maps, we'll follow a strict chronological path today, starting with what cultural policies actually are, then moving through the Vargas era, the military dictatorship, the dismantling under collar, the era of incentive laws, and finally, what the future holds for Brazilian culture. So part 1, what exactly are cultural policies? Before we get lost in dates in historical eras, we absolutely have to nail down our academic baseline. When the examiners talk about public cultural policy, they mean an ordered, coherent set of precepts and objectives guiding immediate public action. But here's the crucial takeaway for your notes. We are looking at how the state acts across 3 main pillars. We look at how art and heritage are produced, how they circulate, and how they are consumed by the population. Even if a historical government didn't publish a formal master plan, we can analyze their actions across these 3 pillars to figure out what their policy actually was. And as you can see from this timeline, spanning from the 1930s with Vargas through the 70s dictatorship, the 90s under Collor, and the Cardoso era, the history of cultural policy in Brazil is definitely not a straight line of progress. It's actually full of massive leaps forward and really sudden, abrupt steps back. Which brings us to part 2, the Vargas era and the very first cultural structures. Let's rewind to the 1930s to see how the foundation of state-sponsored culture was actually built. Pay close attention to this for your exam. Vargas's first government, between 1930 and 1945, was when the state first stepped into areas it had literally never touched before. They started preserving physical heritage with SPAN, they regulated cinema with INC, and they expanded the publishing market with the National Book Institute, or INL. Oh, and a huge milestone. In 1932, they rolled out the very first legislation to regulate radio broadcasting, even laying down rules for advertising. Now, how did they pull all this off? Extreme centralization. All of these pioneer actions were consolidated under one incredibly powerful ministry, the Ministry of Education and Health. Led by Minister Gustavo Capanema, the state really took the reins, delivering a highly curated approach to early cultural policy. All right, part 3, the dictatorship, a time of both censorship and expansion. We jump forward to the military regime, and honestly, this era presents a massive historical paradox that examiners absolutely love to test. Here is the paradox you need to remember. After the 1964 military coup, Brazil entered an era of severe censorship and repression, crushing most of the independent cultural projects that had been thriving since the 50s. But, and here's the catch, at the exact same time, hardline governments like Medici and Geisel poured unbelievable amounts of money into expanding the state's own cultural institutions. To understand why, we look to sociologist Sergio Micheli. He points out that programs like the 1973 Cultural Action Plan, or PAC, were highly strategic. The government wasn't just throwing money at events. They were attempting an official thaw. It was a calculated political move to build a bridge with the artistic and intellectual classes they had just severely marginalized. You can actually trace this institutional buildup step by step. First, the 1973 PAC funded national artistic tours. Then, under Geisel, culture became a specific target for social development, leading to the creation of Funarte in 1976. All of this groundwork eventually culminated in 1985, during democratization, with the creation of the standalone Ministry of Culture, finally separating it from the Ministry of Education. Moving on to part 4, color and the Great Dismantling. The whole narrative takes a drastic, devastating turn as we hit the 1990s. A critical historical marker for your exam is the total collapse of the state's cultural infrastructure under President Fernando Collor. With just one single law in 1990, Law 8029, he abruptly extinguished massive institutions like Funarte and Embrafilm and downgraded the newly formed Ministry of Culture to a mere secretariat. It brought the entire sector to an unprecedented standstill. Part 5, the era of incentive laws. While the ministry was eventually recreated, the late 90s, especially under President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, brought a completely new paradigm for how culture gets paid for in Brazil. Have you ever wondered why certain big movies or musicals get huge corporate sponsorships today? This is why. We shifted from the 1970s model, where the state acted as the main curator deciding exactly what got funded, to the 1990s model. Driven by the lei ruonet, the state just offered tax incentives, meaning the private market suddenly got to choose what survived. Just look at these numbers from the Cardozo administration. Out of 80 pieces of cultural legislation, 25 were strictly about tax incentive mechanisms. That's nearly a third of the government's entire administrative energy spent just tweaking tax exemptions. The incentive law basically became the only cultural policy, completely replacing direct state planning.
So, what's the big takeaway here? The money funding these projects comes from tax renunciations, meaning it is technically public money that companies are allowed to hold back from the government. Yet, the power to decide if that public money goes to a local artist or a massive commercial Broadway-style musical was handed entirely to private companies. Naturally, they favor projects with high marketing appeal, leaving the state without any real cultural guidelines. Finally, Part 6, the future of culture. Let's zoom out and look at what all these historical shifts mean for Brazilian society today. The overarching theme our sources highlight is a history of eternal restarts. Brazil really lacks a tradition of long-term public policy. Every time a new government steps in, they tend to scrap the old projects, change the names, and start from scratch. This constant discontinuity leads to a massive, tragic waste of financial resources, human talent, and institutional memory. But despite all these structural roadblocks, establishing solid public policy is absolutely vital. In today's globalized world, culture isn't just weekend entertainment anymore. It's a massive economic engine driving income and employment. Plus, it's the main anchor protecting Brazil's incredible cultural diversity and projecting our national identity to the rest of the world. Which leaves us with a provocative dilemma, perfect for your essay questions on the FADE exam. If public tax money is ultimately what funds our culture through things like the lei ruonet, should private companies really have the final say on what gets produced? Should the state curate for regional diversity, or should corporations curate for marketing? Mastering this historical tension is the absolute key to acing your test. Good luck with your studies, and I'll see you in the next explainer.